Hello students, I welcome you to this session on the state in India, a liberal perspective. The family, the school, the market and the state are institutions which shape the lives of all persons in modern societies. But of these, the most significant is the state, as it has the widest jurisdiction and regulates all other institutions. For various historical reasons, this is particularly true of the Indian state. Therefore, every citizen of India needs to have a well-informed understanding of the structure, functioning and development of the country's state. The state is a complex institution and different perspectives such as liberal, Marxist and Gandhian are employed to examine its many dimensions. In this session, we will scrutinize the Indian state from a liberal perspective. Let's begin by exploring the exact meaning of the key words, the state and liberal, with particular reference to India. People often equate the state with the government, but actually it is a far more comprehensive concept. Political scientists point out that government is only one element of the state. The other three elements include population, territory and sovereignty. So, we can define the state as an institution which exercises supreme power over a set of people occupying a definite area and governs them through an apparatus consisting of the legislature, the executive and the judiciary. The modern state emerged in 17th century Europe and gradually spread to other parts of the world, mainly through colonialism. Today, there is virtually no part of the inhabited world which does not fall within the jurisdiction of one of the 195 states comprising our international system. The word liberal is closely associated with the idea of liberty. Liberalism crystallized in 19th century Europe as an ideology which stood for a socio-economic and political order centered on the liberty of the individual. The liberals emphasize the need to defend the autonomy and dignity of each person from possible violation by other persons, groups and especially by the enormously powerful institution of the state. To achieve this objective, they uphold the sanctity of every individual's rights to life, liberty and property. They also call for a tolerant society, a market economy and a constitutional state as well as the rule of law. Liberals severely criticize despotism as a threat to liberty and advocate a representative democratic form of government based on the consent of the people. Let's now consider the liberal democratic foundations of the contemporary Indian state. There were some republics and many kingdoms as well as empires in various parts of South Asia during its long history before the colonial era. But the institutions, norms and practices that make up the modern state were introduced in the Indian subcontinent during the British Raj. The forces of liberalism, democracy and nationalism were crucial to the formation of the Indian state in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet there were major obstacles to the building of a robust liberal democratic state in independent India. These included the legacy of feudal despotism and alien rule, the prevalence of mass poverty and illiteracy, as well as a traditional collectivist ethos. Fortunately, there were also some enabling factors to which we now turn. Historically, the European middle class made a major contribution to the creation of a liberal democratic state operating through representative governmental institutions. A small but significant middle class emerged during the British Raj and has played a somewhat similar role in the Indian context. The Indian freedom movement was started by middle class leaders in the late 19th century and later it drew the masses into its fold and gave the post-independence state a firm democratic footing. Many of our nationalists were greatly influenced by liberal values. Therefore, these values found a clear expression in the constitution of independent India. The preamble of the Indian Constitution spells out the principles underlying the socio-economic and political order that the Constituent Assembly sought to establish. Among them are such liberal principles as secularism, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith and worship, equality of status and of opportunity, and the dignity of the individual. They are amplified and enshrined in Part 3 of the Constitution, which guarantees to the citizens of the country a set of fundamental rights, including the right to equality, the right to freedom, the right against exploitation, and the right to freedom of religion. In addition to these civil rights, Part 3 provides special protection to the cultural and educational rights of minorities, in keeping with the liberal emphasis on the need to prevent the tyranny of the majority. It further guarantees the right to constitutional remedies, which Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar described as the heart and soul of the Constitution, for it ensures stringent judicial safeguards to all the fundamental rights. Liberalism also recognizes the imperative of providing people positive entitlements to education, work and health within a framework that respects the individual's freedom of choice. The Constitution recommends such welfare rights, especially in Part 4 containing the directive principles of state policy. The constitutionally mandated institutional edifice of the Indian state has an essentially liberal democratic character. The organs of government are structured according to a system of checks and balances for preventing authoritarianism and protecting citizens' liberty. Though the country's parliamentary democracy involves a close connection between the executive and the legislature, the parliament can hold the Council of Ministers accountable. Besides, the judiciary has been granted independence and the power to decide the constitutional validity of laws and policies. The courts have effectively used this power of judicial review to serve public interest, promote people's rights, and preserve the spirit of the Constitution. The centralization of power or an extreme inequality of wealth and status are harmful to the meaningful exercise of liberty. The Constitution includes several provisions to guard against these evils. The federal scheme envisages a decentralized political structure based on the distribution of power among the union, state and local governments, which are formed through free and fair elections contested by several political parties. Besides, the state is expected to create an egalitarian socio-economic order by implementing the directive principles meant to prevent the concentration of resources and to promote the well-being of vulnerable groups like backward classes, women and children. A liberal state can be sustained only if it is complemented by a civil society comprising educational institutions, mass media, non-governmental agencies and an intelligentsia, which are conducive to the promotion of liberty, equal opportunity and tolerance. India has fragile but lively civil society. It is blessed with a number of academic, media and activist organizations which have served as transmitters and protectors of a liberal culture. The country has always had public intellectuals who ably supported liberal causes in the face of great difficulties. They have acted as the conscience of the community and galvanized the state into fulfilling its constitutional commitments. In spite of such strong foundations, the liberal democratic Indian state has faced many challenges. We will examine some salient ones and the responses they have evoked over the last 7 decades. Dawn and decline of the Nehru era, 1947 to 1979. The two post-independence decades are often described as the Nehru era because of the sterling role played by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru in shaping India's political and socio-economic order during that period. While Nehru was committed to the core liberal values, he was critical of the capitalist context in which liberalism had developed in the West. He wanted to prevent the excesses of capitalism by establishing a socialistic pattern of society, ensuring a just social allocation of resources. However, the judiciary saw a contradiction between the redistributive measures adopted by the government in pursuit of its egalitarian objectives on the one hand and such liberal constitutional principles on the other. The judiciary opposed reservations for the backward classes by invoking the right to equality. It considered the land reform program to be violative of the right to property, and it questioned the bid to nationalize select industries on the ground that the policy ran contrary to the freedom of trade and business. The Parliament wanted to overcome these objections. The judiciary also favored a broad interpretation of the right to freedom of speech and expression. This was not acceptable to the Parliament, which sought to place restrictions on the exercise of the right so as to prevent its perceived abuse. It attained these aims by passing the first constitutional amendment in 1951, leaving behind a problematic legacy. The first amendment added the ninth schedule to the Constitution, which was put beyond the reach of judicial scrutiny, and many of the laws challenged by the judiciary were included in the schedule. Today, this schedule contains no less than 280 laws. The policy of reservations in educational institutions and employment has become an expanding universe, often crossing the judicially prescribed 50% limit and threatening the liberal principle of careers open to talents. The freedom of speech and expression has been hemmed in, while the right to property was progressively circumscribed and finally denied the status of a fundamental right by the 44th Constitutional Amendment in 1978. The process of socialist planning also gave rise to a number of paradoxes. The Nehru era witnessed the implementation of comprehensive 5-year plans and the creation of a large public sector to bring about rapid and socially just development. The private sector was tightly regulated by the government. This statist approach to the economy was at odds with the liberal advocacy of a free market, but it continued for over 4 decades. It did generate some benefits, but eventually created a license permit quota Raj, stifled private initiative and became counterproductive. Only the Swatantra Party, which was founded in 1959, systematically challenged the menace of statism. But its championship of liberalism remained a cry in the wilderness, and the party itself ceased to exist in 1974. The late 1960s witnessed a split in and declining dominance of the Indian National Congress, as well as the rise of the violent Naxalite movement inspired by Maoism. The shaky consensus underlying the Nehruvian order began to fall apart. A full-fledged crisis of legitimacy erupted when the veteran Gandhian leader Jai Prakash Narayan launched a nationwide movement against corruption and misrule in 1974. And a year later, the Allahabad High Court annulled Indira Gandhi's election to the Lok Sabha on the grounds of electoral malpractices. Prime Minister Gandhi responded to these events by having a state of national emergency declared in June 1975, dealing a body blow to liberal principles and practices. The constitution was arbitrarily amended, elections were postponed, civil liberties were suspended, parliament was reduced to a rubber stamp, judicial independence was threatened, the press was muzzled, and the opponents were put behind bars. Interpreting this as an indication of popular support, Indira Gandhi decided to hold parliamentary elections. An unintended consequence of the emergency was the unification of several opposition parties, leading to the formation of the Janata Party, which successfully contested the elections held in March 1977. The Janata government rolled back some of the worst legacies of the emergency by releasing political prisoners and revoking the coercive constitutional amendments and laws enacted by the previous regime. But in some other respects, it failed to discard earlier illiberal tendencies. It drove the last nail in the status of the right to property as a fundamental right by shifting it from Part 3 to Part 12 of the Constitution, which deals with other matters like finance, contracts and suits. It also persisted with the deeply entrenched and regrettable practice of breaching federal autonomy and by dismissing duly elected Congress governments in 9 states, the trajectory of a fractured polity, 1980 to 2013. Indira Gandhi returned to power in 1980, but a ham-handed approach to the Sikh aspiration for autonomy, culminating in a military operation targeting the Golden Temple in Amritsar, triggered her tragic assassination in October 1984. The subsequent anti-Sikh riots rocked Delhi and stoked the Khalistani movement for the creation of an independent Sikh state. Liberal secularism received another jolt in 1986 when the Rajiv Gandhi-led Congress government passed a law diluting the divorced Muslim women's right to alimony. The agitation to build a Ram temple on the site of the Babri Masjid in Uttar Pradesh gained momentum at the same time, leading to the destruction of the mosque in December 1992, followed by Hindu-Muslim riots throughout the country. Thus, the stage was set for the creation of a fractured polity. The state's inability to manage political conflicts by peaceful means resulted in a large-scale deployment of repressive apparatuses, posing a grave threat to the liberal way of life. Unfortunately, such deployment remains a chronic feature of the Indian state's modus operandi. There has been an excessive reliance on laws granting extraordinary powers to the military in many parts of the country declared as disturbed areas. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act has been in force in the Northeast since 1958. Similar laws have been enforced in the Punjab during 1983 to 1997 and in Kashmir since 1990. The implementation of these laws has generated a great deal of violence, agony and violation of human rights. Apart from overt repression inflicted by the state in response to perceived security threats, there are also covert and pervasive forms of structural violence that are inimical to the sustenance of a liberal order. The Indian society is rife with instances of such violence springing from deep-seated structures of ethnic and class inequality as well as patriarchy. Consequently, discrimination and atrocities against Adivasis, Dalits, other minorities, workers and women have been ubiquitous features of Indian social life. Several laws, policies and institutional mechanisms have been put in place to prevent such violence, but it persists, sometimes with the connivance of state personnel and agencies. Since the 1980s, the judiciary has been playing a proactive role in redressing the wrongs suffered by people due to various state agencies' acts of commission and omission. It has done so by encouraging innovative forms of public interest litigation. Social activists and organizations have worked in tandem with the judiciary to protect the rights of and secure entitlements for a wide range of vulnerable groups such as laborers in the informal sector, prisoners, people displaced by development projects and slum dwellers facing the threat of eviction. The passing of the Right to Information Act by the Parliament in 2005 was a major outcome of this synergy. The Act is a useful tool for ensuring governmental accountability. We have already noted the drawbacks of the state-dominated Indian economy. By 1991, they had given rise to a major financial crisis, compelling the then Congress-led government to secure an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund and to announce a new economic policy. That policy sought to liberalize the economy through deregulation, privatization and globalization. Entrepreneurial initiative and market dynamics rather than comprehensive planning and government control were to be the motor force of development. It seemed that the Swatantra Party's advocacy of a liberal policy vision had finally gained acceptance. But the unfolding of economic reforms revealed many anomalies. The implementation of liberalization was sluggish and haphazard. Moreover, it came to be increasingly marred by an unholy collision between the politicians, bureaucrats and capitalists, which had been endemic to the Indian state. The rate of economic growth rose, benefiting the upper and middle classes, but the neglect and decline of the agrarian sector caused a spate of farmer suicides. The policy of giving industry privileged access to rural and tribal areas through special economic zones backfired, eliciting massive popular resistance. Maoism re-emerged with a vengeance, creating a red corridor across several states in the southern, central and eastern regions of the country. The sway of crony capitalism put paid to the liberal dream of a free market economy operating within a transparent framework of governance. It resulted in corruption on an unprecedented scale, exposing the warped anatomy of the Indian state. The most shocking instance of corruption occurred under the aegis of the United Progressive Alliance government in 2007-2008. It involved gross irregularities in the allotment of 2G spectrum to certain mobile telephone companies for pecuniary gain, causing a loss to the public's exchequer which ran into more than 1,500 billion rupees. The Supreme Court played an important role in exposing the 2G scam and in bringing the culprits to book, but it became abundantly clear that an effective ombudsman was needed to stem the rot of corruption on a long-term basis. In 2011, the senior social activist Anna Hazare launched a campaign demanding a law to create a People's Ombudsman or Jana Lokpal, which soon snowballed into a popular upsurge. This movement for cleansing the country's public life received the unstinting support of the mass media. The tremendous pressure generated by these events led the parliament to pass the Lokpal and Lokayuktas Act in 2013, boosting the country's legal infrastructure of accountability, which is an important component of a liberal polity. Continuing challenges and retrieval of the liberal legacy. A liberal state is expected to treat all its citizens fairly without practicing arbitrary discrimination on caste, religious or linguistic grounds. It guarantees to each citizen the same set of rights and obligations anchored in a common civic identity. Such a notion of citizenship is integral to the normative basis of the Indian state. However, a sense of shared citizenship has been difficult to attain in the face of extreme heterogeneity, and of late it has come under increasing pressure due to the proliferation of parochial identity politics. The splintered process of modernization in a highly unequal society and the divisive mobilization strategies of political parties have aggravated the clash of ethnic identities and imperiled the liberal credentials of the state. A major consequence of identity politics is the placing of the ethnic community above the larger political community and of emotion above reason. This in turn leads to mounting intolerance as people are ever ready to take offense at perceived insults to the beliefs, practices, symbols and heroes cherished by their respective communities. Tolerance is a cardinal principle of liberalism, and its decline poses a great threat to the free exchange of ideas and opinions, which is the very lifeblood of a liberal society. The epidemic of intolerance has also infected the Indian state, as testified by its complicity in the banning of books and in censorship of various kinds. All democracies are prone to the temptation of pursuing policies aimed at appeasing significant sections of voters by granting their narrow, self-serving demands. The Indian state is succumbing to the illiberal temptation in a big way. This is because of a drastic decline in the dedication to a genuinely inclusive strategy of development and governance, which is evident across the entire political spectrum. As a consequence, the state has put the common good in jeopardy while encouraging castes and other ethnic groups to vie for a share of the limited public resources, undermining its obligation to promote fraternity. We have noted that the founders of the Indian Republic provided constitutional protection to minority rights and secular principles, heeding the liberal emphasis on averting the tyranny of the majority. However, majoritarianism has cast a dark shadow on contemporary Indian society and politics, resulting in repeated attacks on many minority communities' right to pursue their distinctive ways of life with autonomy and dignity. Even within the so-called majority community, the dissenting individual's right to freedom of thought and expression is under threat from the self-appointed guardians of orthodoxy, who are frequently able to secure the overt or covert backing of the state. Scholars, writers, artists, and social reformers, women who defy patriarchal structures, and people practicing alternative sexualities are common targets of such supposedly majoritarian wrath. Despite numerous threats, the liberal heritage of the Indian state still survives thanks to its enshrinement in the Constitution and its stout defense by the media and civil society organizations. Of particular relevance here is the Supreme Court's verdict in the Kesavananda Bhati case of 1973, forbidding the Parliament to alter the basic structure of the Constitution. But we must note that the judiciary itself faces a twofold constraint. The internal constraint stems from the occasionally illiberal stance taken by certain judges. Thus, in 2013, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutional validity of Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which has adverse implications for the sexual rights of gay persons. Besides, the judiciary has been accused of upsetting the delicate balance of power among the organs of government by interfering in matters beyond its proper purview. The external constraint is evident in the executive's attempt to curtail judicial autonomy by controlling the appointment of judges. The media and civil society groups are also not free of comparable constraints. Therefore, sustained multi-pronged efforts are needed to disseminate liberal values and to ensure that they flourish. It is particularly important to build an educational system promoting the spirit of inquiry and open-mindedness. Finally, it is essential to build an enduring national consensus on a set of core principles and practices drawn from the country's long tryst with liberalism. Thank you.